Hi, everybody. Well, we made it, didn't we? How many of you have been watching from the beginning and seen all 7 of these Prayerful Pause episodes that are part of the Holy Week series? Today, as we look at Easter Sunday, let me begin by saying, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. That greeting became the password, the byword, the secret greeting among Christians for most of the first couple of centuries. That's how you could tell a Christian when they would meet each other in the marketplace or to get into worship, especially when the worship services were hidden and were secret. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. It's important for us to remember that. Our faith was not, and the early church was not based around birth narratives. There are only 2, really, of those, Matthew and Luke, but around resurrection. A lot of people were crucified. There are experiences and accounts of other resurrections. But the way that Jesus approached his death and resurrection made these events become both personal and political. Now, there's a lot written about this in the Borg and Crossan book. I urge you to read it, and you might even be able to get just a chapter or 2 online through Google Read or something like that. But they discuss the difference between, or not difference, they discuss the complementary approaches to Easter of both history and parable. Now, history, we can talk about what is fact, what is fiction. But parable, and I'm going to read a couple of sections here, says, when we see these stories as parable, the parables of Jesus that he used to teach, the model for this understanding is the parables of Jesus. And Christians agree that the meaning of Jesus' parables is not dependent upon whether they are historically factual. You think about the Good Samaritan. Nobody really cares if there was a guy from, Samaria walking around or not. But the obvious insight of the parables is true, and that can come to us more easily sometimes through a story. As they write here, quote, importantly, parable and parabolic language can make truth claims. So I invite us to look at Easter through the eyes of parable. And it's kind of interesting. Mark, you will recall, was the first of the Gospels written. It was not the first of the Christian writings. Those were Paul's letters, and they were a good decade and a half, 2 decades before Mark wrote his Gospel. So Paul is the first one who talks about the resurrection of Jesus, but it is Mark who first gives us a narrative of Jesus' life. Around the year 70, the early 70s. And then in the 80s and 90s, it's Matthew and Luke, somewhere in there. And then late 90s and into the 2nd century is where John was writing. So you can see the progression of the Easter story. In Mark, I thought this was interesting. In Mark, there are only 8 verses dedicated to the resurrection. Matthew, there were 20 verses. In Luke, there were 53 verses. And in John, there were 56. Interesting. So it becomes a more involved, more detailed story as we go along. But if we look at Mark's account of Easter as a parable, we see that there are a lot of applications that we can make to our own lives. For instance, Jesus was sealed in a tomb, but the tomb could not contain him, could not hold him. Where does that happen in our lives? Where have people tried to shut us down, but our excitement, energy, whatever, the will of God was so great that it opened it back up again? Jesus is not found in the land of the dead. How often do we go looking for something and it's not where we think it's going to be? We find it someplace else. And in those cases where we are thinking that something has died or been finished or whatever, we find that no, it's still alive, just in a new form. That's a pretty wonderful metaphor to come out of Easter, isn't it? Jesus, quote, who was crucified by the authorities, has been raised by God. So that I like that metaphor, or I like looking at Easter metaphor and drawing that conclusion because we think we're so special. We think we're so smart and so important. And God comes along and says, no, here's where you're going to go. You can put all your time and energy into that, but, I'm going to put you over here. God, I like to say God will not be mocked. God's way is going to happen no matter what. And then his followers are promised, you will see him. How many times have you seen Jesus? Every day? I think so. He's with us all the time, so how often do we see him? According to Mark's gospel, really, the resurrection is all about new life and how to do life. And at the very end of the gospel, Mark has the disciples ordered to go back to Galilee, which a lot of scholars think means go back to the beginning of the gospel because it was starting in Galilee. So if you go back to the beginning of the gospel, then we are reminded that all of Jesus' life was supposed to be about the way and the kingdom. So we are to always refresh ourselves by revisiting those things that Jesus said, that Jesus did, that we are called to do. Now, Easter, we will never know what happened, right? And we could have long arguments. I don't know if it matters. One of my colleagues, a retired minister, said that somebody once said to her when she was struggling with what happened on Easter, just finally said to her, so-and-so, the bottom line is the tomb empty or not? And I think that is a good bottom line for us. Is the tomb empty? Do we believe that something happened, even if we don't know what it is? And how does that affect us? The other thing that they stress in the book that I want to lift up to us is that it's death and resurrection. They come as a package. We can't just have the one without the other and be truly Christian and living our faith. It's easy to see that you can't, if you just have death without resurrection, then, that's not what Jesus was teaching. But the counter is also true. If you have just resurrection and you don't want to deal with the death and the ugly things, that's not a full faith either. We need to have both death and resurrection. Both were a part of his story. If we only focus on Good Friday, then the focus is all on pain and agony and defeat. If we only focus on Easter and glorious celebration, we're not getting how glorious the celebration is because we haven't dealt with the other. See what I mean? I think that, obviously a lot of us don't like to deal with Good Friday or even Maundy Thursday, I think. But Borg and Crossan point out that Easter is both personal and political. He was a political leader, Jesus was. He was convicted of sedition, of trying to overthrow Rome. One guy, one little Palestinian Jew. But he did overthrow Rome. It took time, and it was his followers that did it. Would that have happened if everything had ended on Friday with the crucifixion? Of course not. He would have been just like those other thousands of crucified along the roads leading into and out of Jerusalem. It's the resurrection that makes the difference. That's what makes the story so palatable, because it gives us hope. It gives us a sense of new life and new direction and new possibilities. Some churches you'll go to, and maybe you grew up in those traditions, have Jesus on the cross. And for those churches, a crucifix. For those churches, Good Friday is a huge deal. And we can talk about this substitutionary aspect of the crucifixion if you want to. I don't happen to subscribe to that, but they also cover it a lot in the book. Again, so you might want to grab hold of that and read it. But what's really important, I think, in those churches, in those denominations, is the act of him dying for us. Well, in other churches, you will never find a crucifix, like Presbyterians, almost never, because we focus on the resurrection and the cross is empty. So where do you focus your attention? Well, is it back on Good Friday and what was done to him, or is it on the possibility that comes with resurrection and new life and new possibilities, where the sky is the limit? And frankly, personally, for me, one of the primary messages that appeals to me every year is that God proved once and for all that nothing can separate us from God's love, not even death. So I have nothing to fear here, because I know that when I leave this life and I move on to the next, that I am surrounded by God's love, that wherever I go, God's love is there. I wish you a happy Easter. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Thank you for joining me for the Prayerful Pause with the Pastor, and perhaps for this whole Holy Week series. We'll be back to our regular Monday through Friday schedule tomorrow. I hope to see you then. Until then, enjoy the day. Celebrate new life. Think about where God is leading you to new life in your own life. Possibilities. Wowza. They're endless, aren't they? I'm Pastor Deb Swift of both South and Downtown Presbyterian Churches in Rochester, New York. Happy Easter, everybody. Bye for now.